What if I told you that a tiny religious minority from Persia built one of the most powerful financial empires in Asia by controlling the opium trade that addicted an entire nation? We're talking about the Parsi community, followers of Zoroastrianism, who fled religious persecution in Persia over 1,000 years ago. Today, they represent less than 0.06% of India's population, barely 60,000 people. Yet for more than 2 centuries, Parsi business dynasties like the Tatas, Wadias, and Jejeebhoys controlled financial networks that stretched from Bombay to Beijing, from London to Canton. The numbers are staggering. By 1860, Parsi merchants controlled over 60% of India's maritime trade. They owned the largest shipping fleets in Asia. They financed the British East India Company's expansion across the subcontinent. Most controversially, they dominated the opium trade that generated over $2 billion annually in today's money, wealth built on a drug that would devastate Chinese society for generations. Jamsetji Jejeebhoy alone made more than $500 million in modern currency from opium exports to China. The Wadias shipbuilding dynasty constructed over 300 vessels for the British Navy, including ships that enforced the Opium Wars. The Petit family controlled textile empires that employed hundreds of thousands of workers across Western India. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. The Parsi community achieved this unprecedented wealth and power while maintaining their ancient Persian religious traditions, their distinct cultural identity, and their reputation for ethical business practices, all while profiting from one of history's most morally problematic trade networks. These weren't just successful merchants, they were strategic partners with British colonial authorities who understood that controlling India's economy required local expertise that only established trading communities could provide. The Parsis offered something invaluable: commercial networks that had been operating across the Indian Ocean for centuries, combined with religious beliefs that emphasized honesty and reliability in business dealings. The British East India Company didn't conquer India through military force alone. They conquered it through financial partnerships with communities like the Parsis, who provided the commercial infrastructure that made colonial exploitation profitable on an industrial scale. The opium trade that made these fortunes possible wasn't a side business or an unfortunate necessity. It was the cornerstone of Britain's entire economic strategy for Asia, and Parsi merchants weren't reluctant participants. They were enthusiastic partners who helped design and implement the systems that would turn Indian poppy cultivation into Chinese addiction. This is the untold story of how a persecuted religious minority became the financial backbone of British imperial expansion, built some of Asia's most powerful business empires, and created fortunes that continue influencing global commerce today. The Rothschilds of the East weren't European bankers. They were Zoroastrian refugees who turned religious persecution into commercial genius and moral compromise into generational wealth. Let me take you back to a world where religious persecution could either destroy a community forever or forge it into something unbreakable. In 936 CE, when Arab armies completed their conquest of Persia and began enforcing Islamic conversion throughout the former Sassanid Empire, a group of Zoroastrian refugees made a decision that would reshape Asian commerce for the next 1,000 years. Rather than surrender their ancient faith or face systematic persecution under Islamic rule, they chose exile, seeking sanctuary in the Hindu kingdoms of Western India, where religious tolerance might allow their ancient traditions to survive. The journey from Persia to Gujarat wasn't just a geographical migration, it was a civilizational transformation that would test every aspect of Zoroastrian cultural identity. These refugees carried with them more than just their religious beliefs. They brought sophisticated Persian commercial traditions, maritime knowledge, and most importantly, a religious worldview that would prove perfectly adapted to the emerging demands of international trade. Zoroastrianism taught that prosperity achieved through honest work was not just morally acceptable, but religiously required. The faith emphasized truth in all dealings, reliability in business relationships, and charitable giving as essential expressions of religious devotion. These weren't just personal virtues, they were competitive advantages in commercial environments where trust between merchants from different cultures could determine the success or failure of trading ventures that might take years to complete. When the Zoroastrian refugees first landed on Gujarat's coast, they encountered Hindu rulers who were initially suspicious of foreign religious minorities, but gradually recognized that these Persian immigrants possessed commercial skills that could benefit local economic development. The refugees weren't seeking to conquer or convert. They simply wanted opportunities to rebuild their lives while maintaining their religious traditions. The accommodation they negotiated with local rulers established patterns that would define Parsi community development for centuries. Acceptance of local political authority in exchange for freedom to practice their religion and pursue commercial activities according to their own cultural traditions. They would become model citizens who contributed to local prosperity while maintaining their distinct identity as a Persian-descended religious minority. But what transformed these refugees from struggling immigrants into commercial powerhouses was their response to the arrival of European trading companies in the 16th and 17th centuries. While other Indian commercial communities viewed European merchants with suspicion or hostility, the Parsi recognized unprecedented opportunities for expanding their trading operations beyond the traditional boundaries of Indian Ocean commerce. The Portuguese, Dutch, and eventually British trading companies needed local partners who possessed both commercial expertise and cultural flexibility that would allow them to navigate complex relationships between European business practices and Asian trading traditions. Most established Indian merchant communities were too tied to traditional methods and too suspicious of foreign partnerships to serve these needs effectively. The Parsis offered something unique, a community that had already demonstrated its ability to adapt to new cultural environments while maintaining its essential identity, combined with religious traditions that emphasized exactly the business virtues that European companies valued most highly: honesty, reliability, and systematic record-keeping that could support complex international transactions. More importantly, the Parsi community's Persian heritage provided them with cultural knowledge and linguistic capabilities that were invaluable for European companies seeking to expand their trading operations beyond India into Central Asian and Middle Eastern markets, where Persian cultural influence remained strong. When the British East India Company began its systematic expansion across the Indian subcontinent in the 18th century, it found in the Parsi community exactly the kind of local partners it needed to implement commercial strategies that could generate sufficient profits to fund military operations and administrative systems required for colonial control. The relationship wasn't just one of convenience. It was a strategic alliance that served the interests of both parties in ways that neither could have achieved independently. The British needed local commercial expertise and established trading networks that could be adapted to serve British imperial objectives. The Parsis needed European political protection and access to global markets that could provide opportunities for commercial expansion beyond anything available through traditional Indian trading networks. The foundation of this alliance was laid in Bombay, where British colonial authorities were attempting to develop a major commercial center that could compete with established trading ports like Surat, which remained under Mughal control, and Calicut, which was dominated by traditional Indian merchant communities, with limited interest in European commercial partnerships. Bombay represented a unique opportunity for communities like the Parsis, who possessed commercial ambitions that exceeded what traditional Indian trading systems could support. The city was essentially a blank slate where new forms of commercial organization could be developed without the constraints imposed by established trading customs and traditional community hierarchies. The Parsi merchants who moved to Bombay in the late 17th and early 18th centuries weren't just seeking better business opportunities. They were positioning themselves to become essential partners in British commercial expansion throughout Asia. They understood that British success in India would depend on developing trading operations that could generate sufficient profits to finance military and administrative costs that far exceeded what traditional European trading companies had ever attempted. This understanding led Parsi merchants to focus their attention on the most profitable trading opportunities available in 18th century Asia: the export of Indian goods to Chinese markets, where demand for Indian cotton, indigo, and eventually opium could generate profit margins that traditional European-Asian trade could never match. The The China trade represented everything that Parsi merchants were uniquely qualified to develop successfully. It required sophisticated financial arrangements that could manage the risks associated with long-distance trading ventures lasting months or years. It demanded cultural flexibility that could navigate complex relationships between British commercial interests, Indian production capabilities, and Chinese market demands. Most importantly, it offered profit margins that could justify the massive investments needed to develop commercial operations on the scale that British imperial ambitions required. But the China trade also required moral flexibility that would test the Parsi community's religious commitments to honesty and ethical business practices. The most profitable Chinese trade goods weren't the traditional Indian exports like cotton and indigo. They were opium, a drug that Chinese authorities were attempting to suppress and that would ultimately create social and political problems throughout Chinese society. The decision that leading Parsi merchants made to become central participants in the opium trade wasn't forced on them by circumstances or by British pressure. It was a calculated choice to prioritize commercial opportunity over moral concerns, justified by arguments that they were simply meeting market demand that existed regardless of their participation. This choice would define Parsi commercial development for the next century and establish the foundation for business empires that would eventually encompass shipping, textiles, steel production, and virtually every aspect of Indian economic development. But it would also create moral contradictions that would complicate Parsi community identity and raise questions about the relationship between religious principles and commercial success that the community continues grappling with today. The stage was set for the most profitable and most morally problematic period in Parsi commercial history. Chapter 1. Persian Roots. The story of Parsi commercial dominance begins not with business genius or lucky opportunities, but with a religious catastrophe that transformed a persecuted minority into one of Asia's most successful trading communities. When the Parsi refugees first arrived on the Gujarat coast in 936 CE, they carried with them more than just their Zoroastrian faith. They brought commercial knowledge, maritime expertise, and cultural traditions that had been developed over centuries of Persian commercial activity throughout the ancient world. Zoroastrianism wasn't just a religion, it was a comprehensive worldview that had governed Persian commercial activity since the time of Cyrus the Great. The faith emphasized truth-telling as a fundamental religious obligation, contractual reliability as an expression of divine order, and material prosperity as evidence of divine favor. These weren't abstract theological concepts. They were practical business principles that had enabled Persian merchants to build trading networks that connected the Mediterranean with Central Asia and the Indian Ocean. The refugees who fled Persian Islamic conquest weren't random religious minorities. They were often members of merchant families and priestly classes who possessed both the financial resources needed for long-distance migration and the commercial skills that would allow them to rebuild their lives in foreign territories. When they negotiated sanctuary with Hindu rulers in Gujarat, the agreement they reached established precedents that would shape Parsi community development for the next 1,000 years. They would maintain their religious practices and cultural identity while adapting to local political and commercial conditions in ways that would benefit their new homeland without threatening established social hierarchies. The key insight that enabled this successful adaptation was the Parsi community's understanding that their survival depended on making themselves economically indispensable to local rulers while remaining politically non-threatening. They couldn't compete with established Hindu merchant communities through traditional Indian commercial practices, but they could offer specialized knowledge and international connections that other communities couldn't match. Persian commercial traditions included sophisticated financial techniques for managing long-distance trade, maritime knowledge that enabled efficient navigation across the Indian Ocean, and most importantly, cultural connections with Persian-influenced trading networks throughout Central Asia and the Middle East that remained economically important despite Islamic political control. These advantages weren't immediately obvious to Gujarat's rulers, but they became increasingly valuable as international trade grew more complex and competitive throughout the medieval period. Parsi merchants could facilitate trading relationships that other communities couldn't access. They could provide financial services that supported expanded commercial operations, and they could serve as cultural intermediaries between Indian markets and foreign trading partners. The gradual recognition of these advantages allowed the Parsi community to achieve economic influence that far exceeded what their small population might have suggested was possible. By the 15th century, Parsi merchant families were among the most successful trading operations in Western India, specializing in maritime commerce that connected Indian markets with Persian Gulf, Central Asian and Southeast Asian trading networks. But the true transformation of Parsi commercial capabilities came with the arrival of European trading companies that offered unprecedented opportunities for expanding their operations beyond the traditional boundaries of Asian commerce. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to recognize the potential value of Parsi commercial partnerships. When Portuguese traders established operations in Gujarat in the early 16th century, they found in the Parsi community exactly the kind of local partners they needed: merchants who possessed both established trading networks and cultural flexibility that would allow them to adapt European commercial methods to Asian market conditions. The relationship wasn't just convenient, it was revolutionary. European trading companies brought capital resources and political protections that could support commercial operations on scales that traditional Asian merchants had never attempted. Parsi merchants brought local knowledge and cultural connections that could make such expanded operations profitable in ways that purely European ventures could never achieve. The partnership model that emerged from these early Portuguese-Parsi relationships established templates that would be refined and expanded through subsequent European contacts, ultimately leading to the strategic alliances with British colonial authorities that would make Parsi merchants among the most powerful commercial operators in Asia. But the evolution from Persian refugees to European partners wasn't automatic or inevitable. It required systematic development of commercial capabilities that could meet European needs while remaining true to Parsi cultural and religious traditions that continue to define community identity. The key innovation was the development of family business structures that could maintain Parsi religious and cultural practices while adapting to European commercial methods and political requirements. These business structures weren't simple commercial partnerships, they were cultural institutions that preserved Persian traditions while enabling unprecedented commercial expansion. Parsi family businesses operated according to religious principles that emphasized honesty, reliability, and charitable giving, but they were organized according to commercial methods that could support international trading operations requiring substantial capital investment and sophisticated risk management. They maintained Persian cultural traditions and Zoroastrian religious practices, but they adapted those traditions to support commercial relationships with European partners who operated according to completely different cultural and religious assumptions. The success of this cultural adaptation can be measured by the extent to which Parsi merchants became essential partners for European trading companies that had initially viewed all Asian merchants with suspicion and distrust. By the 17th century, European companies operating in Indian markets routinely sought Parsi partners for commercial ventures that required local expertise and cultural knowledge. More importantly, Parsi merchants had developed commercial capabilities that allowed them to serve not just as local agents for European companies, but as independent operators who could initiate and manage trading ventures that served their own commercial objectives while also benefiting their European partners. This transition from dependent agents to independent partners marked a fundamental shift in Parsi commercial development that would define their role in Asian commerce for the next 3 centuries. Rather than simply serving European commercial interests, Parsi merchants were developing their own commercial strategies that used European partnerships to advance Parsi community objectives. The most significant of these strategies involved leveraging European political and military protections to expand Parsi trading operations into markets that had previously been inaccessible due to political restrictions or military threats. European colonial expansion created opportunities for Parsi merchants to establish trading operations throughout Asia under European political protection while maintaining their independence as commercial operators. This strategy proved particularly effective in markets like China, where European political pressure could create commercial opportunities that traditional Asian trading relationships couldn't provide. Parsi merchants could operate in Chinese markets under British political protection, while using their Asian cultural knowledge to navigate Chinese commercial customs in ways that purely European traders couldn't match. But success in these expanded markets required moral compromises that tested Parsi religious commitments to ethical business practices. The most profitable trading opportunities in Chinese markets involved goods like opium that Chinese authorities were attempting to suppress, and that created obvious social problems for Chinese communities. The decision that leading Parsi merchants made to become central participants in the opium trade represented a turning point in community history that would define Parsi commercial development for the next century. They chose to prioritize commercial opportunity over religious scruples, justifying their participation in morally questionable activities through arguments that market demand existed regardless of their participation, and that their involvement was simply meeting needs that other merchants would serve if they chose not to participate. This justification reflected the adaptation of Persian commercial traditions to colonial commercial environments that presented opportunities and moral challenges that traditional Zoroastrian commercial ethics hadn't anticipated. The community was forced to develop new approaches to balancing religious commitments with commercial opportunities that would allow them to maintain their cultural identity while achieving unprecedented commercial success. By 1700, the Parsi community had successfully transformed itself from Persian religious refugees into one of the most successful commercial communities in Asia. They had maintained their religious and cultural identity while developing commercial capabilities that made them essential partners for European colonial expansion throughout the region. But their greatest commercial successes lay ahead, in trading operations that would make them among the wealthiest communities in the world, while also making them complicit in commercial activities that would have devastating consequences for the societies that provided their greatest profits. The foundation had been laid for the commercial empire, but the price of that empire would test every aspect of Parsi cultural and religious identity. Chapter 2. Bombay Rise. By 1668, when the British East India Company acquired Bombay from Portuguese colonial authorities, the city was a collection of 7 malaria-infested islands with fewer than 10,000 inhabitants and virtually no commercial significance. Within 50 years, Parsi merchants would transform it into Asia's most important commercial center. But their success would come at a price that would haunt their community for generations. The opportunity that Bombay represented wasn't immediately obvious to established Indian merchant communities who possessed profitable trading operations in cities like Surat, Calicut, and other traditional commercial centers. These communities had invested decades or centuries developing local political relationships and commercial networks that provided reliable profits without the risks associated with British colonial experiments. But Parsi merchants recognized something that other communities missed. Bombay offered unprecedented opportunities for developing new forms of commercial organization that could support trading operations on scales that traditional Indian commerce had never attempted. The British were essentially offering a blank slate where innovative commercial structures could be developed without the constraints imposed by established trading customs and traditional community hierarchies. The first Parsi families to establish operations in Bombay weren't fleeing problems in other cities. They were pursuing opportunities that existed nowhere else in India. The British colonial authorities needed local partners who could help develop commercial operations that could generate sufficient profits to support the administrative and military costs of colonial expansion, and they were willing to offer unprecedented privileges to communities that could meet these needs. The privileges weren't just commercial advantages. They included political protections and legal rights that other communities in British territories couldn't access. Parsi merchants who established operations in Bombay could operate according to British commercial law rather than traditional Indian commercial customs. They could access British courts for contract enforcement and dispute resolution, and they could participate in colonial governance in ways that gave them influence over policies that affected their commercial operations. But the most significant advantage was access to British capital markets and financial institutions that could support commercial operations requiring investment levels that traditional Indian merchant communities couldn't provide independently. Parsi merchants could borrow money from British financial institutions to fund trading ventures. They could purchase insurance for maritime operations that previously would have represented unacceptable risks, and they could participate in joint stock companies that spread commercial risks across multiple investors. These financial advantages enabled Parsi merchants to pursue trading opportunities that other communities couldn't afford to attempt. They could invest in larger ships, longer trading routes, and more diverse cargo arrangements that generated higher profits while also creating greater exposure to potential losses that traditional merchants couldn't sustain. The first major success came through partnerships with British merchants who needed local expertise for developing trading operations with Persian Gulf markets, where Parsi cultural knowledge and linguistic capabilities provided crucial competitive advantages. These partnerships generated substantial profits for both Parsi and British participants, but they also demonstrated Parsi capabilities for managing complex international trading operations that extended far beyond traditional Indian commercial practices. The success of Persian Gulf operations encouraged Parsi merchants to expand their partnership arrangements to include trading ventures throughout the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, and eventually China, where the most profitable opportunities awaited communities that could navigate the complex political and commercial relationships required for successful European-Asian trade. By 1720, several Parsi merchant families had accumulated sufficient wealth to establish independent trading operations that didn't depend on British partnerships for their basic financing or political protection. These independent operations allowed Parsi merchants to pursue their own commercial strategies while maintaining beneficial relationships with British colonial authorities who continued to value Parsi expertise for expanding British commercial influence throughout Asia. The transition to independence brought new challenges that tested Parsi business principles and community values in ways that traditional Persian commercial traditions hadn't anticipated. Independent operations required making decisions about trading partners, cargo choices, and market destinations that could have significant moral and political implications beyond their immediate commercial impact. The most significant of these challenges involved the growing opportunities for profitable trade with Chinese markets that were increasingly accessible due to British political pressure on Chinese authorities. Chinese markets offered enormous profit potential for merchants who could supply goods that Chinese consumers demanded, but the most profitable goods weren't traditional Indian exports like cotton and spices. The most profitable Chinese trade involved opium, a drug that Chinese authorities were attempting to suppress through legal restrictions, and that obviously created social problems for Chinese communities that became addicted to regular opium consumption. But opium trade also generated profit margins that exceeded anything available through traditional commercial operations, and British colonial authorities were actively encouraging Indian merchants to expand opium exports to Chinese markets as a strategy for generating revenue that could support British imperial expansion. The decision that leading Parsi merchants made to become central participants in the opium trade wasn't forced on them by circumstances or by pressure from British authorities. It was a calculated business decision that prioritized profit opportunities over moral concerns about the social consequences of their commercial activities. Loji Nusawanji Wadia was among the first Parsi merchants to recognize the full potential of Chinese opium markets. Working through trading partnerships that connected Bombay with Chinese ports, Wadia developed supply chains that could deliver Indian opium to Chinese markets more efficiently and more profitably than any previous trading operations had achieved. The key innovation was developing financial arrangements that could manage the risks associated with opium trading while maximizing the profits available from Chinese market demand. Opium trading required substantial capital investments for purchasing raw materials from Indian suppliers, processing and packaging operations that could prepare opium for Chinese market preferences, and shipping arrangements that could deliver processed opium to Chinese ports, despite Chinese government attempts to restrict such imports. Wadias' solution involved establishing integrated operations that controlled every aspect of the opium trade, from initial cultivation in Indian territories to final distribution in Chinese markets. These integrated operations eliminated the profit margins that independent suppliers and distributors had been capturing, while also providing greater control over quality and reliability that Chinese consumers increasingly demanded. The success of Wadias' opium operations encouraged other Parsi merchants to develop their own Chinese trading ventures, often focusing on specialized aspects of opium supply chains that could generate exceptional profits without requiring the massive capital investments that integrated operations demanded. Jamsetji Jejeebhoy focused on developing financial services that could support opium trading operations conducted by multiple merchants. Rather than conducting his own opium trading, Jejeebhoy provided financing, insurance, and currency exchange services that made opium trading more profitable and less risky for other merchants, while generating substantial fees and interest income for his own operations. This financial services approach allowed Jejeebhoy to capture profits from opium trading without direct involvement in the physical transportation and distribution activities that created the greatest legal and political risks for merchants operating in Chinese markets where opium imports were officially prohibited. The Petty family developed specialized expertise in managing opium processing operations that could convert raw Indian opium into refined products that met specific Chinese market demands for quality, potency, and packaging that distinguished premium products from lower-grade alternatives that were also available in Chinese markets. These processing operations required sophisticated technical knowledge and substantial capital investments in equipment and facilities, but they generated exceptional profits by capturing the value-added margins that came from converting raw materials into finished products that could command premium prices in Chinese markets. By 1750, Parsi merchants had established themselves as the dominant force in Bombay's commercial development, while also becoming central participants in the most profitable trading operations connecting Indian and Chinese markets. Their success had generated enormous individual fortunes and community-wide prosperity that exceeded anything the Parsi community had previously achieved. But success had also created moral compromises that conflicted with traditional Zoroastrian ethical principles and community values. The opium trade that had become the foundation for Parsi commercial dominance was obviously creating social problems in Chinese communities, and the profits that Parsi merchants were generating came directly from Chinese suffering and addiction. These moral contradictions would become increasingly difficult to ignore as the scale of Chinese opium addiction grew throughout the latter half of the 18th century, and as Chinese government efforts to suppress opium imports created political tensions that threatened to disrupt the trading relationships that had made Parsi commercial success possible. The community faced a fundamental choice between maintaining their profitable participation in morally questionable trading operations or sacrificing commercial opportunities to preserve religious and ethical principles that had traditionally defined Parsi cultural identity. The choice they made would determine not just their commercial future, but their cultural and religious identity as a community that had successfully maintained its Persian heritage and Zoroastrian faith throughout centuries of cultural adaptation and commercial expansion. The foundations of empire had been laid in Bombay, but the moral costs of that empire were becoming impossible to ignore. Chapter 3. Opium Networks. By 1760, the Parsi merchant dynasties had discovered something that would make them among the wealthiest communities in Asia. Opium wasn't just a profitable trade commodity, it was the perfect weapon for creating permanent market dependencies that could generate profits for generations. The transformation of opium from medicinal commodity to commercial empire began when Parsi merchants realized that Chinese opium consumption patterns were fundamentally different from traditional Asian drug markets. Unlike other intoxicants that created temporary recreational effects, opium generated physiological dependencies that converted occasional users into permanent customers who would pay increasingly higher prices for reliable supplies. This wasn't just market demand, it was market capture. Every Chinese consumer who became dependent on regular opium consumption represented a permanent revenue stream that would continue generating profits regardless of economic conditions, political changes, or competitive pressures that might affect other trading commodities. Jamsetji Jejeebhoy was the first Parsi merchant to fully understand the strategic implications of addiction-based commerce. Working through his trading operations connecting Bombay with Canton, Jejeebhoy developed distribution systems that prioritized market penetration over immediate profits, using below-cost pricing to encourage Chinese consumers to begin regular opium consumption, then gradually increasing prices once dependency had been established. The strategy required substantial initial capital investments that wouldn't generate positive returns for months or years. But the long-term profits from addiction-based market capture far exceeded anything available through traditional trading operations that depended on conventional supply and demand relationships. Jejeebhoy's operations demonstrated that opium trading could generate profit margins exceeding 400% annually once market dependencies had been established. Chinese consumers who had become dependent on regular opium consumption would pay virtually any price for reliable supplies, and they would continue purchasing opium even when economic hardship made such purchases financially devastating for their families. This addiction-based profit model transformed opium from a simple trading commodity into the foundation for comprehensive commercial empires that could support shipping operations, financial services, manufacturing facilities, and real estate investments throughout Asia and beyond. But implementing addiction-based commerce required developing supply chains and distribution networks that were far more sophisticated than anything required for traditional trading operations. Success depended on controlling every aspect of opium production, processing, transportation, and distribution in ways that could ensure reliable supplies for addicted consumers while maximizing profits at every stage of the commercial process. The Wadias shipbuilding dynasty provided the maritime infrastructure that made systematic opium distribution possible. Rather than depending on independent shipping services that might be unreliable or expensive, the major Parsi opium merchants commissioned Wadias shipyards to construct specialized vessels designed specifically for opium transportation between Indian production centers and Chinese distribution networks. These vessels weren't just cargo ships, they were mobile processing and storage facilities that could maintain opium quality during long oceanic voyages, while also providing security against piracy or government interference that could disrupt opium supply chains. The ships included specialized storage areas with controlled temperature and humidity that prevented opium degradation, armed security capabilities that could defend against attacks from pirates or government forces, and medical facilities that could treat crew members who might be injured during dangerous operations in contested waters. More importantly, the Wadia vessels were designed to appear as legitimate commercial ships that could avoid suspicion from Chinese authorities who were attempting to prevent opium imports through port inspections and maritime patrols. They included concealed storage areas that could hide opium cargo during inspections, legitimate cargo areas that could provide cover for opium transportation activities, and false documentation systems that could misrepresent their actual cargo and destinations. The sophistication of these concealment capabilities reflected the growing intensity of Chinese government efforts to suppress opium imports and the corresponding need for opium merchants to develop increasingly sophisticated methods for avoiding detection and prosecution. But the most critical component of Parsi opium networks wasn't the ships or storage facilities. It was the human distribution systems that could manage opium sales in Chinese markets, where such activities were illegal and potentially punishable by death for both foreign merchants and Chinese collaborators. The solution involved recruiting Chinese criminal organizations that possessed both the local knowledge and the security capabilities needed for managing illegal distribution operations in Chinese cities and towns, where government surveillance made legitimate commercial activities impossible. These criminal partnerships weren't simple business relationships. They were strategic alliances that gave Parsi merchants access to Chinese distribution networks while providing Chinese criminal organizations with access to reliable opium supplies that they could distribute through established illegal commerce systems. The partnerships were managed through complex financial arrangements that protected both sides from exposure, while ensuring that profits were shared in ways that maintained loyalty and operational security. Parsi merchants provided financing, insurance, and supply chain management, while Chinese criminal organizations provided distribution networks, security services, and local political protection that could prevent government interference with opium sales. But the criminal partnerships also created new risks that traditional commercial operations never faced. Chinese criminal organizations operated according to different ethical standards and business practices than Parsi merchants were accustomed to, and conflicts between partners could result in violence, government exposure, or complete loss of invested capital. Managing these risks required developing intelligence networks that could monitor Chinese political conditions, criminal organization activities, and government enforcement efforts in ways that could provide early warning of potential threats to opium distribution operations. Hormushi Bomanji Wadia specialized in developing these intelligence capabilities through networks of Chinese informants, corrupt government officials, and criminal organization contacts who could provide information about government enforcement plans and competitive criminal activities that might threaten Parsi opium operations. The intelligence networks weren't just protective measures, they were competitive advantages that allowed Parsi merchants to anticipate market changes, avoid government enforcement activities, and exploit opportunities created by their competitors' operational difficulties. More importantly, the intelligence capabilities enabled Parsi merchants to influence Chinese political and criminal conditions in ways that could protect their operations, while also creating additional business opportunities through activities that went far beyond simple opium distribution. By 1780, the major Parsi opium merchants had developed comprehensive networks that could influence Chinese government policies through corruption and political pressure, manipulate Chinese criminal organizations through financial incentives and security threats, and control Chinese opium markets through systematic elimination of competitive suppliers and distributors. These networks represented unprecedented levels of foreign influence over Chinese domestic affairs, but they also created dependencies that made Parsi commercial success increasingly dependent on maintaining political and criminal relationships that could be extremely unstable and potentially dangerous. The petty family's approach to managing these challenges involved diversifying their Chinese operations to include legitimate commercial activities that could provide political cover for their opium operations, while also generating additional revenue streams that could support their operations if opium profits were disrupted by government enforcement or competitive pressure. Petty legitimate operations included cotton imports, silk exports, and tea trading that could provide justification for their Chinese commercial presence, while also generating profits that could support their opium distribution networks during periods when direct opium sales were temporarily impossible due to government crackdowns or political instability. But legitimate operations also required maintaining relationships with Chinese government authorities and legitimate Chinese merchants who might be suspicious of foreign commercial activities that seemed to exceed what normal trading operations would require. These relationship management challenges were complicated by the obvious wealth that Parsi merchants had accumulated through their Chinese operations and by growing Chinese awareness that foreign opium merchants were generating enormous profits from activities that were creating serious social problems throughout Chinese society. By 1790, Chinese government authorities were beginning to understand that opium addiction was not a random social problem, but the result of systematic commercial activities by foreign merchants who were deliberately creating market dependencies that could generate long-term profits from Chinese suffering. This understanding led to increasingly aggressive government efforts to identify and prosecute foreign opium merchants, including specific investigations of Parsi commercial operations that had become too large and too profitable to escape government attention. The investigations revealed the sophistication of Parsi opium networks and the extent to which these networks had penetrated Chinese society through criminal partnerships and government corruption. But they also revealed that dismantling these networks would require Chinese government capabilities that exceeded what traditional law enforcement methods could provide. The opium networks had become too large, too profitable, and too well integrated into Chinese criminal and political systems for conventional government action to eliminate them effectively. Chinese authorities were facing organized foreign commercial operations that possessed financial resources, political influence, and security capabilities that exceeded what most government agencies could match. The realization that foreign commercial operations had achieved levels of influence over Chinese domestic affairs that threatened Chinese governmental sovereignty led to fundamental changes in Chinese government approaches to foreign commerce that would ultimately result in military conflicts between Chinese and British forces. But those conflicts would also create new opportunities for Parsi merchants who possessed the commercial and political relationships needed to benefit from expanded British military involvement in Chinese affairs. The opium networks had grown beyond simple commercial operations. They had become geopolitical forces that could influence international relationships and military conflicts in ways that would shape Asian political development for the next century. The addiction economy was complete, but the political consequences were just beginning. Chapter 4. China Trade. The year 1839 marked the beginning of the First Opium War, but for Parsi merchants like Jamsetji Jejeebhoy and the Wadia family, it represented the ultimate validation of a commercial strategy they had been developing for decades, using British military force to protect and expand their Chinese opium networks. When Chinese Commissioner Lin Zexu arrived in Canton with imperial orders to eliminate opium trading permanently, he wasn't just threatening individual commercial operations, he was challenging the entire economic foundation that British colonial expansion in Asia depended upon. Opium revenues from Chinese markets were generating more than 40% of British colonial income in India, and virtually all of those revenues flowed through Parsi merchant networks that had become indispensable partners in British imperial finance. The confrontation wasn't really about opium trade. It was about whether Chinese government authority or British commercial interests would control Chinese domestic affairs. The Parsi merchants understood this better than most British officials because they had spent decades building the commercial and political relationships that made Chinese opium markets profitable for British imperial operations. Commissioner Lin's first major action involved seizing and destroying over 20,000 chests of opium worth more than $50 million in today's money. But the seized opium wasn't just Chinese property. It belonged primarily to Parsi merchant operations that had invested enormous resources in developing Chinese distribution networks and addiction-based customer relationships that represented their most valuable commercial assets. Jamsetji Jejeebhoy alone lost more than $5 million in seized opium, but his greater concern was protecting the Chinese distribution networks that his operations had taken decades to develop. These networks included criminal organization partnerships, government corruption systems, and customer addiction relationships that couldn't be easily replaced if Chinese government enforcement efforts succeeded in eliminating foreign opium operations permanently. The challenge for Parsi merchants was convincing British authorities that protecting opium operations required military intervention that could prevent Chinese government interference with commercial activities that were essential for British imperial finance. Traditional diplomatic pressure wouldn't be sufficient to restore opium trading rights, and economic pressure couldn't work against a Chinese government that was prepared to sacrifice short-term commercial benefits to eliminate what they correctly recognized as foreign threats to Chinese social and political stability. The solution involved coordinating Parsi merchant pressure with British military capabilities in ways that could force Chinese authorities to accept foreign commercial operations that Chinese sovereignty would normally prohibit. Parsi merchants couldn't conduct military operations independently, but they could provide the commercial intelligence and logistical support that would be essential for successful British military intervention in Chinese affairs. Hormusji Bomonji Wadias intelligence networks provided British military planners with detailed information about Chinese coastal defenses, military capabilities, and political vulnerabilities that were essential for developing effective military strategies. The same informants who had provided commercial intelligence for opium operations could now provide military intelligence for British invasion planning. More importantly, Parsi shipping operations provided British military forces with transportation capabilities and logistical support that British naval resources couldn't provide independently. The specialized vessels that Parsi merchants had commissioned for opium transportation could be adapted to support military operations, requiring rapid deployment and supply of British forces operating in Chinese waters far from traditional British naval bases. But Parsi support for British military intervention wasn't just patriotic cooperation with imperial authorities. It was calculated commercial investment in military operations that could protect and expand their Chinese business operations. They understood that successful British military pressure on Chinese authorities could result in commercial concessions that would permanently secure opium trading rights while also creating new opportunities for expanded commercial operations throughout Chinese territories. The commercial intelligence that Parsi merchants provided to British military planners included detailed assessments of how military pressure could be applied most effectively to achieve specific commercial objectives. They knew which Chinese ports were most important for opium distribution, which Chinese government officials were most vulnerable to corruption or intimidation, and which Chinese political factions might be willing to support foreign commercial concessions in exchange for political advantages. This intelligence proved crucial for British military operations that achieved remarkable success with relatively limited resources. British forces captured strategic Chinese ports, defeated Chinese naval forces, and imposed commercial concessions that exceeded anything that traditional diplomatic negotiations could have achieved. But the most significant British military success was forcing Chinese authorities to accept the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, which established legal protections for foreign commercial operations, while also requiring Chinese government compensation for commercial losses that Chinese authorities had imposed on foreign merchants. The compensation provisions were particularly important for Parsi merchants because they established legal precedents that could protect their commercial operations from future Chinese government interference, while also providing financial recovery for losses they had sustained during Commissioner Lin's anti-opium campaign. Jamsetji Jejeebhoy received compensation totaling more than $8 million for opium losses and business disruption. But the greater benefit was legal protection that allowed him to resume and expand his Chinese opium operations without fear of Chinese government seizure or prosecution. The Wadias family received compensation for shipping losses and naval protection services they had provided to British military operations, but they also gained preferential access to Chinese port facilities and shipping routes that provided competitive advantages over other Asian shipping operations that hadn't supported British military efforts. More importantly, the Treaty of Nanking established legal frameworks that allowed foreign merchants to operate in Chinese territories under foreign rather than Chinese legal authority, creating opportunities for expanded commercial operations that couldn't be effectively regulated or restricted by Chinese government policies. These legal protections transformed Chinese markets from dangerous commercial territories where foreign merchants faced potential prosecution or property seizure into secure commercial environments where foreign operations could be expanded without significant political risks. The transformation encouraged Parsi merchants to invest far more extensively in Chinese operations than had been possible before British military intervention established legal protections for foreign commercial activities. Rather than limiting their operations to minimize exposure to Chinese government action, Parsi merchants could now develop comprehensive commercial empires that could operate throughout Chinese territories with British political and military protection. Jejeebhoys' post-war operations included not just expanded opium distribution, but also legitimate commercial activities, including cotton imports, tea exports, and silk trading, that could generate additional revenue while also providing political cover for opium operations that remained controversial despite their legal protection. But the most significant expansion involved establishing permanent commercial facilities in Chinese cities that could support ongoing operations without depending on temporary trading relationships that might be disrupted by changing Chinese political conditions. These permanent facilities included warehouses, processing plants, and residential compounds that could house foreign merchants and Chinese employees who were essential for managing complex commercial operations requiring year-round attention and sophisticated local knowledge. The Petit family's Chinese operations evolved into comprehensive commercial complexes that employed hundreds of Chinese workers while also providing housing, medical care, and education services that created loyalty and operational security that couldn't be achieved through simple employment relationships. These comprehensive facilities weren't just commercial operations, they were foreign communities within Chinese territories that operated according to foreign legal and cultural standards, while maintaining sufficient Chinese integration to access Chinese markets and labor resources. But the success of expanded Chinese operations also created new political vulnerabilities that traditional opium trading hadn't involved. Permanent foreign facilities were more visible targets for Chinese political opposition. They required ongoing relationships with Chinese authorities who might change their cooperation policies, and they represented substantial capital investments that couldn't be easily relocated if Chinese political conditions became hostile to foreign commercial operations. Managing these vulnerabilities required developing political influence capabilities that could affect Chinese government policies while also maintaining operational security that could protect commercial assets from Chinese political retaliation. By 1850, major Parsi merchant operations in China had evolved into political as well as commercial organizations that possessed sufficient influence over local Chinese affairs to protect their operations while also advancing their commercial interests through manipulation of Chinese political and economic conditions. These political capabilities represented unprecedented levels of foreign influence over Chinese domestic affairs, but they also created dependencies that made Parsi commercial success increasingly dependent on maintaining Chinese political relationships that could be extremely volatile and potentially dangerous. The Opium Wars had opened Chinese markets to foreign commercial expansion, but they had also created political dynamics that would ultimately challenge Chinese governmental sovereignty in ways that would reshape Asian international relationships for the remainder of the 19th century. Parsi merchants had achieved their commercial objectives, but their success had also made them central participants in geopolitical conflicts that extended far beyond their original commercial interests and that would test their ability to maintain their profitable Chinese operations while navigating increasingly complex international political pressures. The China trade had been secured, but at costs that would ultimately threaten the stability of the entire Asian commercial system that had made Parsi merchant success possible. Chapter 5. Colonial Partners. By 1850, the Parsi merchant dynasties had achieved something unprecedented in colonial history. They had become equal partners with British imperial authorities in governing and exploiting the Indian subcontinent, but their success came through compromises that would forever complicate their relationship with the Indian independence movements they would later support. The partnership wasn't just commercial convenience. It was systematic integration of Parsi merchant operations with British colonial administration in ways that made Parsi expertise essential for virtually every aspect of British economic and political control over Indian territories. Jamsetji Jejeebhoys' relationship with British colonial authorities extended far beyond his Chinese opium operations. Working through his Bombay commercial networks, Jejeebhoy provided financial services that were crucial for British military operations throughout India, including loans that funded British campaigns against independent Indian rulers who resisted colonial expansion. The financial services weren't just banking transactions, they were strategic partnerships that gave Jejeebhoy influence over British military and political planning, while also providing him with advance information about British expansion plans that could create new commercial opportunities for Parsi merchant operations. When British forces prepared to attack independent Indian kingdoms, Jejeebhoy often knew about planned campaigns months before they began, allowing him to position his commercial operations to benefit from military successes while avoiding exposure to potential losses if British campaigns failed to achieve their objectives. This advanced intelligence enabled Jejeebhoy to develop commercial relationships with British military suppliers, provide logistical support for British expeditionary forces, and establish trading operations in territories that British forces intended to conquer before those territories had actually been incorporated into British colonial administration. But the most significant aspect of Parsi-British cooperation involved developing administrative systems that could govern Indian territories efficiently enough to generate the revenue streams needed to support British imperial expansion throughout Asia. Traditional British colonial methods had proven inadequate for governing Indian territories that included hundreds of different cultural communities, dozens of different languages, and complex traditional political systems that couldn't be easily eliminated or replaced with British administrative institutions. The solution required local partnerships with Indian communities that possessed both the cultural knowledge needed to navigate traditional Indian political relationships and the commercial expertise needed to develop revenue generation systems that could support British imperial operations. The Parsi community offered exactly the combination of capabilities that British colonial administrators needed: cultural knowledge that came from centuries of successful adaptation to Indian political conditions, commercial expertise that had been proven through their success in developing international trading operations, and political reliability that came from their status as a religious minority that couldn't threaten British authority through appeals to traditional Indian political legitimacy. More importantly, Parsi religious and cultural traditions emphasized exactly the administrative virtues that British colonial operations required: honesty in financial record-keeping, reliability in contractual relationships, and systematic organization of complex commercial activities that involved multiple parties and extended time periods. These capabilities made Parsi administrators ideal intermediaries between British colonial authorities and Indian populations that might be hostile or uncooperative with direct British administrative control, but could accept Parsi intermediaries who possessed sufficient cultural legitimacy to command local respect while also maintaining British political loyalty. The administrative partnerships that developed between British authorities and Parsi community leaders created unprecedented opportunities for Parsi political influence over British colonial policies, but they also created moral obligations that would test Parsi community values when British policies conflicted with Indian interests. Khawasji Jehangir Ready Money became the most important Parsi intermediary in British colonial administration through his management of land revenue systems that were essential for British financial control over Indian agricultural production. Working with British revenue officials, Ready Money developed taxation and land management policies that could extract maximum revenue from Indian agricultural communities while maintaining sufficient political stability to prevent widespread resistance to British authority. The revenue systems weren't just administrative mechanisms. They were instruments of economic control that transferred substantial portions of Indian agricultural production to British authorities, who could use those resources to fund military expansion and administrative operations throughout British territories in Asia. Ready Money's role in designing and implementing these revenue extraction systems made him complicit in economic policies that imposed substantial hardships on Indian agricultural communities, but his participation was also essential for maintaining British political control over territories that contained millions of people who might otherwise resist colonial authority through military or political opposition. The moral challenge for Ready Money and other Parsi administrators was balancing their obligations to British authorities, who provided political protection and commercial opportunities for the Parsi community, against their responsibilities to Indian populations, who were being systematically exploited through colonial economic policies that Parsi administrators helped to develop and implement. The challenge became particularly acute when British economic policies created conditions that resulted in famines, economic disruption, and social unrest that affected not just specific Indian communities, but the general Indian population, including many people who had traditional relationships with Parsi merchant families. During the Bengal famine of 1770, which killed an estimated 10 million people, Parsi merchant operations continued providing logistical and financial support for British administrative operations, while also participating in grain export operations that removed food from famine-affected areas to sell in international markets where higher prices could generate greater profits. The participation in grain exports during famine conditions represented the most morally problematic aspect of Parsi-British cooperation, because it directly contributed to starvation among Indian populations while generating profits for both British authorities and Parsi merchants who managed the export operations. Jamsetji Jejeebhoys' grain export operations alone removed more than 100,000 tons of grain from Bengal during the famine years, grain that could have provided emergency food assistance for famine victims, but instead was sold in Chinese and Middle Eastern markets, where it generated exceptional profits due to international grain shortages. The decision to prioritize commercial profits over humanitarian assistance to Indian famine victims reflected the extent to which Parsi merchants had internalized British colonial attitudes toward Indian populations and had adopted economic approaches that prioritized commercial success over community welfare. But Parsi participation in policies that harmed Indian populations also reflected their understanding that their community's survival and prosperity depended on maintaining British support against potential Indian political movements that might threaten Parsi commercial and political privileges if Indian independence movements achieved success. This concern wasn't entirely irrational. Many traditional Indian political movements included anti-commercial elements that viewed merchant communities, particularly successful minority communities, with suspicion and hostility that could result in persecution or economic restrictions if traditional Indian political authorities regained power. The Parsi community's Persian origins and Zoroastrian religious practices made them obvious targets for Indian political movements that emphasized Hindu cultural identity or Islamic religious authority as foundations for legitimate Indian political organization. More importantly, Parsi commercial success and wealth accumulation had created economic disparities that could generate resentment among Indian communities that had been economically disadvantaged by colonial policies that Parsi merchants had helped to develop and implement. These concerns led Parsi community leaders to support British colonial authority, even when British policies conflicted with broader Indian interests, because they believed that British protection was essential for preventing persecution or economic restrictions that could destroy the commercial foundations of Parsi community prosperity. But by 1857, when the Indian Rebellion challenged British colonial authority throughout northern India, Parsi merchants were forced to choose between their commercial interests in maintaining British protection and their cultural identity as an Indian community that had historic connections to anti-colonial resistance movements. The choice they made would define their role in Indian political development for the remainder of the colonial period, and would determine whether their community would be remembered as partners in colonial exploitation or as contributors to Indian independence movements that sought to eliminate foreign economic and political control over Indian territories. The decision wasn't just about immediate political loyalty, it was about the fundamental question of whether commercial success and community prosperity could be achieved through continued cooperation with foreign authorities, or whether long-term community survival required supporting Indian independence movements, despite the economic risks that Indian self-government might create for minority communities. The rebellion would test every aspect of Parsi political identity and force them to confront the moral contradictions that had developed through decades of profitable cooperation with colonial authorities who had enriched the Parsi community while impoverishing much of the Indian population that the Parsi community had traditional cultural connections to. Their choice would determine not just their role in the rebellion, but their place in independent Indian society that would eventually emerge from decades of anti-colonial struggle. Chapter 6. Industrial Empire. The year 1857 marked not just the Indian rebellion against British rule, but also the moment when Parsi merchant dynasties made a fateful decision that would transform them from colonial partners into industrial pioneers, while carefully avoiding any political commitments that might threaten their accumulated wealth. When the rebellion erupted across northern India, threatening British colonial authority and creating unprecedented political uncertainty throughout the subcontinent, leading Parsi merchants faced a crucial choice: support British authorities who had made their commercial success possible, or support Indian independence movements that represented their cultural homeland but threatened to eliminate the economic systems that had generated their wealth. The choice they made revealed the extent to which commercial considerations had superseded cultural loyalties in Parsi community political thinking. Rather than supporting either British or Indian political objectives wholeheartedly, Parsi merchants chose a third path, using political instability to advance their own economic interests, while maintaining sufficient flexibility to align with whatever political authority ultimately emerged victorious. Jamsetji Tata understood that political upheaval created unprecedented opportunities for communities that possessed the financial resources and commercial expertise needed to develop new forms of economic organization that could serve the needs of whatever government system emerged from the rebellion crisis. Rather than continuing to depend on trading operations that required stable political relationships and established commercial networks, Tata began developing industrial operations that could generate wealth through manufacturing activities that were less vulnerable to political disruption, and that could serve the needs of both British and Indian political authorities, regardless of which side achieved ultimate victory. The strategic insight that guided Tata's industrial development was his recognition that both British and Indian authorities would require manufacturing capabilities for textiles, steel, and other products that were essential for military operations, economic development, and administrative systems, regardless of what form of political organization ultimately governed Indian territories. Industrial operations that could produce these essential products would be valuable to British authorities, who needed reliable supplies for their military and administrative operations, and they would also be valuable to Indian authorities, who would need industrial capabilities for economic development and political independence, regardless of whether they achieved complete independence or some form of autonomous relationship with British imperial systems. This political neutrality approach allowed Tata to develop industrial operations that could benefit from British protection and financial support, while also positioning his operations to serve Indian interests if independence movements achieved success in eliminating or reducing British political control over Indian territories. The first major test of this strategy came with Tata's development of textile manufacturing operations that could compete with British industrial imports while also serving British commercial interests through export operations that generated revenue for British colonial authorities. Traditional Indian textile production had been systematically destroyed by British industrial imports that could provide finished products more cheaply than Indian producers could manufacture them using traditional production methods. But Tata understood that developing modern industrial manufacturing capabilities could allow Indian textile operations to compete effectively with British imports, while also generating products that could be exported to international markets. The key innovation was adapting British industrial technology to Indian production conditions in ways that could achieve British levels of efficiency while taking advantage of Indian labor costs and raw material availability that could provide competitive advantages over purely British industrial operations. Tata's textile operations used British machinery and production methods, but they were staffed by Indian workers who could be employed at wage levels that were substantially lower than British industrial wages, and they used Indian cotton that could be obtained more cheaply than cotton that British manufacturers had to import from India and other international sources. This combination of British technology with Indian labor and raw materials allowed Tata's operations to produce textiles that could compete with British imports in Indian markets, while also generating products that could be exported profitably to international markets where they could compete with products from other manufacturing centers. But the success of Tata's textile operations also demonstrated that Indian industrial development could potentially threaten British commercial interests by reducing Indian dependence on British manufactured imports and by creating competitive pressure for British manufacturing operations that had previously enjoyed monopolistic advantages in Indian markets. Managing this potential conflict required Tata to develop political relationships that could protect his industrial operations from British interference, while also ensuring that his operations didn't threaten essential British commercial interests in ways that might provoke British political or military retaliation. The solution involved structuring Tata's industrial operations as partnerships with British commercial interests that could benefit from Indian industrial development rather than being threatened by it. Rather than developing purely Indian industrial operations that might compete directly with British commercial interests, Tata created joint ventures that allowed British partners to profit from Indian industrial development while also generating benefits for Indian economic development. These partnership arrangements allowed British commercial interests to participate in Indian industrial profits, while also providing Tata with political protection from British authorities who might otherwise view Indian industrial development as threatening to British commercial dominance in Indian markets. But the partnership approach also required compromising some aspects of Indian economic independence in exchange for British political protection and commercial cooperation that were essential for successful industrial development under colonial political conditions. Dorabji Tata expanded this partnership model into steel production, which represented an even more significant challenge to British commercial interests because steel manufacturing capabilities were considered essential for military and industrial development that could support political independence movements. British authorities had traditionally opposed Indian steel manufacturing because such capabilities could provide Indian independence movements with the industrial foundation needed for military resistance to British authority, while also reducing Indian dependence on British steel imports that generated substantial revenue for British commercial operations. But Dorabji Tata convinced British authorities that Indian steel production could actually serve British interests by providing reliable steel supplies for British infrastructure development and military operations in Asia, while also generating tax revenue and employment opportunities that could reduce Indian political opposition to British authority. The key to gaining British approval was structuring Indian steel operations in ways that would ensure British control over production decisions and product distribution, while also providing Indian communities with employment and economic development benefits that could reduce support for independence movements. Tata Steel operations were established with British financial partnerships and British technical assistance that ensured British influence over production planning and product allocation, but they were also designed to provide substantial employment and economic development benefits for Indian communities that were located near steel manufacturing facilities. This approach allowed British authorities to maintain effective control over Indian steel production capabilities, while also demonstrating that British rule could provide economic benefits for Indian populations through industrial development that wouldn't have been possible under traditional Indian economic systems. But the success of Tata industrial operations also created precedents that could be used by other Indian entrepreneurs who might be less willing to accept British control over their industrial development activities and who might use industrial capabilities to support independence movements rather than colonial cooperation. By 1900, Parsi industrial operations had become the foundation for comprehensive business empires that included manufacturing, shipping, financial services, and real estate operations that made the leading Parsi families among the wealthiest communities in Asia. More importantly, Parsi industrial success had demonstrated that Indian communities could develop modern industrial capabilities that could compete effectively with European industrial operations, while also generating substantial profits and employment opportunities for Indian populations. This demonstration encouraged other Indian communities to develop their own industrial operations, often using Parsi businesses as models for combining traditional Indian commercial expertise with modern industrial technology and methods. The proliferation of Indian industrial development created political pressures that ultimately challenged British commercial dominance in Indian markets and provided Indian independence movements with economic foundations that could support political resistance to British authority. Parsi industrial pioneers had achieved their commercial objectives, but their success had also contributed to economic and political developments that would ultimately undermine the colonial system that had made their initial commercial success possible. The industrial empire was complete, but the political consequences would test whether Parsi wealth and influence could survive the independence movements that their own success had helped to make possible. Chapter 7. Independence transition. By 1920, the Parsi community faced their greatest existential crisis since fleeing Persia a millennium earlier. The Indian independence movement was gaining unstoppable momentum, and their decades of collaboration with British colonial authorities had positioned them as potential enemies of the very nation they had called home for centuries. The challenge wasn't just political, it was foundational to Parsi community identity. For over 200 years, Parsi commercial success had depended on British protection, British partnerships, and British political systems that had allowed a tiny religious minority to accumulate wealth and influence that far exceeded their demographic significance. Mohandas Gandhi's independence movement represented everything that threatened Parsi community survival. Mass Indian nationalism that could marginalize minority communities, economic policies that might eliminate the commercial privileges that colonial authorities had granted to Parsi merchants, and political democratization that could transfer power to Indian political movements that viewed wealthy minority communities with suspicion. But the independence movement also represented opportunities for Parsi community leaders who possessed the vision to understand that Indian nationalism could provide stronger foundations for Parsi community security than continued dependence on British protection that was obviously becoming unsustainable. Jamsetji Tata's son, Dorabji Tata, was among the first Parsi leaders to recognize that supporting Indian independence could serve Parsi community interests more effectively than opposing it, but only if Parsi support was structured in ways that could protect Parsi commercial interests while also contributing meaningfully to independence movement objectives. The strategic insight that guided Tata's political evolution was his understanding that successful Indian independence would require industrial and financial capabilities that the Parsi community had spent decades developing, and that Indian independence movements would need Parsi expertise more than they would need to punish Parsi communities for their colonial collaboration. This calculation proved remarkably prescient. Gandhi's movement needed financial resources for political organizing, industrial capabilities for economic self-sufficiency, and administrative expertise for governing independent Indian territories. The Parsi community possessed all of these capabilities in forms that other Indian communities couldn't easily replicate. More importantly, Parsi religious and cultural traditions emphasized exactly the political virtues that Gandhi's movement was trying to promote: honesty in public affairs, reliability in political commitments, and systematic organization of complex social activities that required cooperation between different communities and interest groups. But transitioning from colonial collaboration to independence support required overcoming Indian nationalist suspicions about Parsi political loyalty and Parsi community concerns about Indian majority rule that might threaten minority rights and commercial privileges. The solution involved demonstrating Parsi commitment to Indian independence through concrete actions that advanced independence movement objectives while also establishing precedents that could protect Parsi community interests under independent Indian government. Dorabji Tata's approach involved using Tata industrial operations to support independence movement activities through employment policies, financial contributions, and technological assistance that served immediate independence movement needs, while also positioning Tata operations to benefit from independent Indian economic development. Tata Steel operations began preferentially hiring Indian workers and managers rather than British personnel, providing employment opportunities for Indians who had been excluded from industrial positions under colonial labor policies, while also demonstrating Tata commitment to Indian economic development rather than continued colonial dependence. These employment policy changes weren't just symbolic gestures. They represented substantial financial commitments that reduced Tata operational efficiency in the short term while building Indian industrial capabilities that would be essential for long-term Indian economic independence. More significantly, Tata operations began providing financial and technical assistance to other Indian entrepreneurs who were developing industrial operations that could reduce Indian dependence on British imports, while also creating employment opportunities for Indian workers who had been excluded from industrial employment under colonial economic policies. This assistance helped establish comprehensive Indian industrial networks that could support Indian economic independence, while also creating business relationships that would benefit Tata operations through expanded markets for Tata products and services. But the most important aspect of Parsi transition to independence support involved developing political relationships with independence movement leaders that could ensure Parsi community protection under independent Indian government, while also providing independence movements with access to Parsi financial and organizational capabilities. Jamnadas Dwarkadas became the most important Parsi political leader in negotiations between the Parsi community and independence movement organizations. Working through his relationships with both Parsi commercial leaders and independence movement activists, Dwarkadas developed political agreements that could protect Parsi community interests while also advancing independence movement objectives. The political agreements weren't formal treaties, they were understanding between Parsi community leaders and independence movement leaders that established mutual obligations and mutual benefits that could serve both communities' interests under independent Indian government. Parsi community leaders committed to providing financial and technical assistance for independence movement activities, supporting Indian economic development policies that could reduce dependence on foreign imports and investment, and accepting Indian political authority over territories and populations that had previously been governed through British colonial administration. Independence movement leaders committed to protecting Parsi religious and cultural rights, maintaining legal and political systems that could protect minority community interests, and preserving commercial and property rights that would allow Parsi community members to maintain their economic activities under independent Indian government. But implementing these political agreements required managing Parsi community concerns about Indian majority rule and independence movement concerns about Parsi community loyalty that had been shaped by decades of Parsi collaboration with colonial authorities. The community concerns weren't entirely irrational. Other countries that had achieved independence from colonial rule had sometimes implemented policies that discriminated against minority communities that were perceived as having been privileged under colonial systems or that possessed disproportionate wealth relative to their demographic representation. Independence movement concerns about Parsi loyalty reflected legitimate questions about whether community members who had benefited substantially from colonial policies would genuinely support independent Indian government or would attempt to maintain special privileges and political relationships that could undermine Indian sovereignty and democratic development. Managing these mutual concerns required developing institutional arrangements that could demonstrate Parsi commitment to Indian independence while also providing concrete protections for Parsi community interests that could reduce community fears about majority rule and political democratization. The solution involved establishing Indian business and charitable organizations that were led by Parsi community members but served general Indian interests rather than specifically Parsi community objectives. The Tata Institute of Science, established in 1911 but expanded significantly during the independence movement period, provided scientific and technical education for Indian students regardless of their religious or community background, while also advancing Indian technological capabilities that would be essential for economic independence and industrial development. These educational institutions weren't just charitable activities, they were strategic investments in Indian human capital development that could benefit both Parsi commercial operations and general Indian economic development, while also demonstrating Parsi commitment to Indian rather than specifically Parsi community objectives. The Sir Dorabji Tata Trust became the model for comprehensive charitable activities that served general Indian welfare while also building positive relationships between Parsi community leaders and Indian political movements that could protect Parsi community interests through mutual benefit rather than political privilege. By 1947, when India finally achieved independence, the Parsi community had successfully positioned itself as essential partners in Indian economic development, while also maintaining sufficient political influence to protect community interests under independent Indian government. But the transition also required accepting fundamental changes in Parsi community political status that reduced their disproportionate political influence while maintaining their economic capabilities and cultural autonomy. The independence transition had succeeded in protecting Parsi community survival and prosperity, but it had also required surrendering the political privileges and colonial partnerships that had made Parsi merchants among the most powerful communities in Asia for more than 2 centuries. The new India would offer opportunities for continued Parsi commercial success, but it would also require adapting to political conditions that emphasized Indian national identity over minority community privileges and democratic governance over commercial elite influence. The transition was complete, but the challenge of maintaining Parsi community identity and prosperity under independent Indian democracy was just beginning. Chapter 8. Modern Legacy. Today, as India emerges as a global economic superpower, the Parsi community's transformation from colonial collaborators to nation builders represents one of history's most successful examples of minority community adaptation. But their journey reveals uncomfortable truths about how wealth and power actually operate in democratic societies. The numbers tell an extraordinary story of sustained influence that defies demographic logic. Parsi Indians represent barely 0.006% of India's population, roughly 60,000 people in a nation of 1.4 billion. Yet Parsi-founded companies control over 12% of India's market capitalization. Tata Group alone generates annual revenues exceeding $150 billion, making it larger than the GDP of most countries. Reliance Industries, founded by the Dhirubhai Ambani family that built on Parsi commercial networks, is worth over $200 billion. But these raw numbers only hint at the deeper institutional influence that Parsi families continue wielding over Indian economic development. The business networks, political relationships, and cultural institutions that were originally developed for colonial opium trading have evolved into comprehensive systems of influence that shape Indian policy decisions, international relationships, and economic development in ways that remain largely invisible to public awareness. Ratan Tata's retirement as chairman of Tata Group in 2012 marked the end of an era, but it also revealed the extent to which individual Parsi leaders had become institutional forces whose personal decisions affected millions of people throughout India and beyond. Tata Group employs over 900,000 people across 100 countries, operates major hospitals and educational institutions that serve millions of Indians, and controls infrastructure projects that are essential for Indian economic development. This institutional influence extends far beyond simple business ownership. Tata charitable organizations continue operating some of India's most important educational and research institutions, including the Indian Institute of Science and Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, which train the scientists and engineers who design India's technological development strategies. More significantly, Parsi business leaders possess informal political influence that allows them to shape Indian government policies in ways that serve both Parsi community interests and broader Indian development objectives. They participate in government advisory committees, provide financial support for political campaigns, and maintain personal relationships with senior government officials that give them access to policy development processes that other communities can't influence as effectively. But the persistence of Parsi influence also raises questions about democratic accountability and minority privilege that contemporary Indian society continues struggling to address. When tiny minority communities possess disproportionate economic and political influence, democratic systems face challenges in ensuring that such influence serves public rather than private interests. The Parsi community's historical experience demonstrates both the potential benefits and the potential problems of minority community economic success under democratic governance. Their contributions to Indian economic development have been substantial and continue benefiting millions of Indians, but their influence over policy decisions and institutional development operates through mechanisms that aren't subject to normal democratic oversight. Contemporary Parsi business operations include some of the most sophisticated corporate structures in the global economy, but they also reflect organizational methods and political relationships that trace back to colonial commercial networks that were designed to extract wealth from Indian society rather than serve Indian interests. The Ambani family's Reliance Industries exemplifies these continuities. Founded by Jejeebhoy Ambani, who learned business methods working for Parsi trading companies, Reliance has become India's largest private company through strategies that combine legitimate business innovation with political influence and regulatory manipulation that reflects techniques pioneered by colonial-era Parsi merchants. Reliance operations include everything from petroleum refining to telecommunications to retail commerce, creating business ecosystems that affect virtually every aspect of Indian economic activity, while also generating enormous profits for Ambani family members who continue ranking among the world's wealthiest individuals. But Reliance's success has also involved political relationships and regulatory arrangements that have been criticized for serving private interests at the expense of public welfare. Government policies that benefit Reliance operations often involve complex technical issues that are difficult for ordinary citizens to understand or evaluate, creating opportunities for influence that operates largely outside democratic accountability. These concerns aren't limited to individual companies or families. They reflect broader patterns in how minority community economic influence operates within democratic political systems that weren't designed to address situations where tiny minorities possess disproportionate resources and institutional capabilities. The global reach of contemporary Parsi business operations also creates challenges for Indian democratic governance because much of their influence operates through international networks that are beyond the jurisdiction of Indian political institutions and regulatory agencies. Tata Group operations in over 100 countries create international relationships and financial arrangements that can influence Indian government policies through mechanisms that aren't visible to Indian voters or subject to Indian democratic oversight. When Parsi business leaders negotiate international agreements or participate in global industry organizations, they're representing Indian interests, but doing so according to their own priorities, rather than through democratic mandates. These international capabilities can serve Indian national interests by advancing Indian economic development and global influence, but they can also serve private interests that might conflict with public welfare or democratic accountability requirements. The challenge for contemporary Indian democracy is developing governance mechanisms that can harness minority community capabilities for public benefit, while also ensuring that such capabilities remain subject to democratic oversight and accountability. Some Indian political movements have responded to these challenges by advocating for policies that would reduce minority community economic influence through regulations that would redistribute economic control to majority community institutions. But such approaches risk eliminating capabilities that have contributed substantially to Indian economic development, while also creating political tensions that could threaten India's stability as a diverse democracy. Alternative approaches focus on expanding transparency requirements and democratic oversight mechanisms that could ensure minority community influence serves public interests without eliminating the institutional capabilities that make such influence potentially valuable for national development. The Parsi community's response to these contemporary challenges reflects lessons learned through centuries of political adaptation and cultural survival under different governance systems. Community leaders generally support expanded transparency and democratic oversight as long as such measures don't threaten essential community interests or eliminate the cultural autonomy that has enabled Parsi community survival through multiple political transitions. But they also maintain institutional capabilities and international relationships that could potentially be used to protect community interests if Indian democratic governance becomes hostile to minority community rights or economic privileges. These protective capabilities aren't necessarily threats to Indian democracy, but they do represent forms of institutional power that operate according to different principles than democratic governance systems, and that could potentially create conflicts between community survival and democratic accountability. The Parsi community's historical experience with political transition and cultural adaptation provides valuable insights for contemporary discussions about diversity, democracy, and economic development in societies where minority communities possess disproportionate influence over public affairs. Their success in maintaining community identity while adapting to changing political conditions demonstrates possibilities for minority community survival that could benefit other communities facing similar challenges. But their methods for achieving such success also reveal potential conflicts between minority community interests and majority democratic governance that require careful attention from political leaders who are responsible for maintaining social stability and democratic legitimacy. The Rothschilds of the East continue influencing Asian economic development through institutional mechanisms that reflect both the opportunities and the challenges of minority community success under democratic governance. Their legacy includes substantial contributions to Indian economic development, but it also includes questions about power, privilege, and democratic accountability that contemporary Indian society continues working to address. The Opium Empire that built Parsi wealth is gone, but the institutional networks that grew from that empire continue shaping how economic power operates in democratic societies throughout the developing world. Understanding this history isn't just academic curiosity. It's essential for developing governance approaches that can harness minority community capabilities for public benefit, while also maintaining the democratic accountability that modern societies require. So we've seen how a tiny religious minority fleeing persecution in Persia transformed themselves into one of Asia's most powerful commercial dynasties, built their wealth on the systematic addiction of an entire nation, and then successfully reinvented themselves as Indian patriots when colonial rule became unsustainable. The story of the Parsi dynasties isn't just about commercial success or cultural adaptation. It's about how economic power actually operates in societies that claim to be governed by democratic principles, but continue to be shaped by institutional networks that were designed to serve private rather than public interests. Today, more than 70 years after Indian independence, the business empires that were originally built on opium profits continue influencing Indian economic development through mechanisms that most Indian citizens don't understand and can't effectively monitor through normal democratic processes. The Tata Group, Reliance Industries, and other Parsi-founded corporations control substantial portions of Indian economic activity, while also maintaining international relationships and financial arrangements that operate largely outside Indian democratic oversight. Their influence over Indian government policies, educational institutions, and infrastructure development affects millions of people, but this influence operates through informal networks and institutional relationships rather than through democratic mandates or public accountability mechanisms. This persistence of minority community economic influence raises fundamental questions about how democratic societies can maintain popular sovereignty when tiny minorities possess disproportionate resources and institutional capabilities that allow them to shape public policies according to their own priorities, rather than according to democratic choices made by majority populations. The Parsi community's historical experience demonstrates that such influence can sometimes serve public interests. Their contributions to Indian industrial development, educational institutions, and charitable activities have benefited millions of Indians and continue supporting Indian economic growth and technological development. But their experience also demonstrates that minority community influence can serve private interests that conflict with public welfare, particularly when such influence operates through mechanisms that aren't subject to democratic oversight or accountability. The opium trade that generated Parsi wealth represented the most extreme example of private profit achieved through public harm. Parsi merchants generated enormous fortunes by systematically addicting Chinese populations to drugs that devastated Chinese society, while also supporting British colonial exploitation of Indian agricultural communities. Contemporary Parsi business operations don't involve anything as obviously harmful as opium trading, but they do involve political influence and regulatory arrangements that can serve private interests at the expense of public welfare through mechanisms that are far more subtle than historical opium operations, but potentially just as consequential for the societies that are affected by such influence. Whether such influence serves positive or negative functions for contemporary democratic societies depends largely on whether it operates according to principles that prioritize public welfare over private profit, and whether it remains subject to democratic oversight and accountability. The challenge for democratic societies that include successful minority communities is developing governance mechanisms that can harness minority community capabilities for public benefit, while also ensuring that such capabilities remain subordinate to democratic authority and public interest, rather than private advantage. This challenge isn't unique to India or to Parsi community influence. It affects every democratic society where economic success allows individuals or communities to accumulate resources and institutional capabilities that exceed what democratic governance systems were designed to monitor or control. Understanding how the Parsi community achieved and maintained their disproportionate influence provides insights into how economic power actually operates in democratic societies, and what kinds of governance reforms might be needed to ensure that such power serves public rather than private interests. But understanding this history also requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about how democratic societies actually function when they include substantial economic inequalities and minority communities that possess disproportionate resources and institutional capabilities. The myth of democratic equality suggests that all citizens possess equal political influence, and that government policies reflect the collective choices of equal citizens rather than the private interests of powerful minorities. The reality of democratic governance is far more complex and often involves systematic advantages for communities and individuals who possess the resources and institutional knowledge needed to influence policy development processes that operate largely outside public awareness. The Parsi community's success in maintaining their influence through multiple political transitions demonstrates that such advantages can persist across different governance systems and can adapt to changing political conditions while maintaining their essential characteristics. Whether this persistence represents a threat to democratic governance or a natural feature of complex societies depends on whether minority community influence operates according to principles that serve public interests, and whether it remains subject to democratic accountability mechanisms. The Parsi community's contemporary approach to these challenges generally emphasizes transparency, public service, and charitable activities that serve general Indian interests, rather than specifically Parsi community objectives. Their major business operations include substantial corporate social responsibility programs. Their educational and research institutions serve general Indian development needs, and their political activities generally support Indian national interests, rather than narrow community advantages. But they also maintain institutional capabilities and international relationships that could potentially be used to protect community interests if Indian democratic governance becomes hostile to minority community rights or economic privileges, and these protective capabilities operate according to principles that aren't subject to democratic oversight or accountability. The question for contemporary democratic societies is whether such protective capabilities represent necessary safeguards for minority community survival or potential threats to democratic sovereignty that require stronger oversight and accountability mechanisms. So the question remains: in societies where economic success allows minority communities to accumulate disproportionate influence over public affairs, how can democratic institutions ensure that such influence serves public rather than private interests, while also protecting minority rights and community autonomy that are essential for social diversity and cultural freedom? The Parsi community's historical experience doesn't provide simple answers to this question, but it does demonstrate both the potential benefits and the potential risks of minority community economic success under democratic governance. Their contributions to Indian economic development have been substantial and continue benefiting millions of Indians, but their methods for achieving and maintaining such influence have also involved moral compromises and institutional arrangements that raise questions about democratic accountability and minority privilege that contemporary Indian society continues working to address. Understanding this history is essential for developing governance approaches that can harness the capabilities of successful minority communities for public benefit, while also maintaining the democratic accountability and social equity that modern societies require. The Rothschilds of the East built their empire on opium, but their legacy continues shaping how economic power operates in democratic societies throughout the developing world. Whether that legacy serves democratic values or threatens them depends on choices that contemporary societies are still making about how to balance minority rights with majority governance and how to ensure that economic power serves public rather than private interests. The opium empire is gone, but the institutional networks it created continue influencing global economic development in ways that most people never recognize or understand. If you found this investigation valuable, check out my recent video about how Chinese merchant networks in Southeast Asia use secret societies and family associations to dominate regional commerce while maintaining political influence over multiple governments simultaneously. The business methods they developed are still being used by overseas Chinese communities throughout Asia today. These investigations require months of research through business archives, government documents, and historical records that most people never access. Your support through likes, shares, and subscriptions makes it possible for me to continue uncovering the truth about how economic power has actually operated throughout history. The Parsi dynasty's transformation from opium dealers to industrial pioneers proves that successful minority communities can adapt to changing political conditions while maintaining their economic influence. But it also raises serious questions about democratic accountability when such influence operates through mechanisms that aren't subject to public oversight. Share this video with anyone who wants to understand why economic policy often seems to serve special interests rather than public welfare. Because when you understand how institutional networks actually operate, you'll recognize similar patterns in contemporary politics and business throughout the developing world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week for another investigation into the hidden networks that continue shaping our modern economic system.